13. Cory Martin. In 2018, a dog walker in Brooklyn's Canarsie Park found a limbless human torso covered in leaves. More gruesome discoveries followed in the form of garbage bags containing other severed female body parts. The victim was identified as 26-year-old Queens resident Brandy Odom, who had turned to escorting to make ends meet, but was trying to get on a better path when she was killed. Weeks after Brandy's murder, investigators uncovered surveillance footage of her roommate and pimp, Cory Martin, loading garbage bags into his car the night before the remains were discovered. Martin hired a lawyer and refused to speak with the police, and the investigation stalled. An arrest finally came in November 2020, nearly 2.5 years after Brandy's horrific death. Federal authorities charged Odom and the woman's other roommate, Adele Anderson, with wire fraud and aggravated identity theft for allegedly plotting to kill Brandy and taking life insurance policies out in her name. According to prosecutors, Martin pimped out both women while working on his long-term plan to profit from Brandy's death. He and Anderson fraudulently took out life insurance policies totaling $200,000 in Brandy's name, with Anderson listed as Brandy's sister and the sole beneficiary. The pair also allegedly watched The First 48 and Dexter in preparation for the murder. The suspects repeatedly tried to cash in on life insurance policies after Brandy's death, but the companies were unwilling to pay, and all that TV they watched proved pointless, given the multitude of evidence uncovered by investigators in the form of text messages, internet search histories, and the purchase of an electric saw. Anderson was initially considered a co-conspirator in the case, and the evidence showed that she was aware of the plot to kill Brandy. But prosecutors also acknowledged that she was a victim who obeyed Martin's commands out of fear for her life and under constant threats of physical abuse and death. According to court documents, Martin controlled essentially every aspect of Anderson and Odom's lives, right down to telling them when they could bathe and what they could eat and where. He also had access to the woman's electronic devices and kept their earnings, including a payment he received in exchange for arranging Brandy's marriage to a green card seeker. In late 2021, Anderson took a plea deal. Around the same time, Martin was hit with additional charges, including murder for hire. In early 2024, a federal judge found him guilty of murder for hire conspiracy, aggravated identity theft, wire fraud conspiracy, and identity fraud for the purpose of a life insurance scheme. He faces a mandatory life sentence, and there's no parole in the federal system, which means he'll remain behind bars until his dying day. 12. Ishani. After dropping out of high school in 2017 and being kicked out of a friend's apartment in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania over a disagreement about money, Corina Slusser went to New York City. She told her concerned mother that she had landed an office job in Brooklyn, but in reality she had started escorting. Corina tried to shield her mother from the ugly side of her new profession, including after she was assaulted in a hotel room just weeks after entering the dangerous line of work. The suspect, 32-year-old Giovanni Pogero, had a disturbing history of prior convictions for human trafficking and promoting prostitution, serving as a clue to the possible nature of his relationship with Corina. The court granted Corina an order of protection against Pogero and sent it to her mailing address in Pennsylvania, which happened to be her mother's house. When her mom opened the letter and asked questions, Corina claimed she had been robbed and tried to play it off like it was no big deal. During that time, she met 21-year-old aspiring rapper and pimp named Ishani. On the surface, everything continued to seem fine in Corina's life. She had even gotten her own apartment in the Bronx, and it seemed like she was thriving in the big city. But things were a lot different in real life than how she made them look on social media. For many of the people who knew her back home in Pennsylvania, the first sign that anything was amiss came when Corina suddenly fell radio silent just days after moving into her new place. The troubled young woman was last seen alive in person 10 days later outside a motel in Queens. Later that day, Corina called her mother Sabina Torto and said that she wanted to return home. She also told her mother that someone had stolen her social security card and driver's license. Sabina was out of town for a funeral and said they would talk when she returned to Pennsylvania in a few days. About an hour after that, Corina text messaged Pogero, the pimp who had been arrested for beating her up, and begged him to let her come see him. She said someone had left her at a motel with no money or food. It's unclear whether she and Peguero met up that evening, but she has not been heard from since. At first, investigators suspected that Peguero might be holding Corina against her will. They also began looking into Ishani as a person of interest, after discovering that he had posted online escorting ads featuring Corina and other women. There were numerous reported sightings of Corina, but these claims were never substantiated, and she remains missing to this day. In October 2018, federal authorities charged Ishani with trafficking Corina and the other women who were featured in the escorting ads. According to the FBI, Wani forced and coerced both victims to engage in prostitution. Wani was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but the outcome of the case gave little comfort to Sabina, who is still looking for her daughter. Peguero was charged in state court with crimes relating to the promotion of prostitution, but law enforcement officials remain tight-lipped about the details of the investigation, leaving Corina's loved ones in the dark about whether she may have been a victim in those crimes. 11. Lawrence McFarland. In November 2023, a pre-trial detainee and former pimp in Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, made startling claims to authorities about being a serial killer. 40-year-old Lawrence McFarland was in custody for allegedly tying up a man and woman and physically assaulting them both. Police discovered the victims at a Milwaukee apartment while responding to a 911 call from a witness who fled from the residence. McFarland was arrested on suspicion of battery, strangulation and suffocation, assault, and 2 counts of false imprisonment. During questioning, he reportedly told investigators that he often hears voices telling him to kill people. Even more alarmingly, he claimed that he was a former pimp who had killed numerous women across multiple cities over a nearly 25-year period. Although McFarland could not remember exactly how many women he had supposedly murdered, he said he had strangled and torched at least 3 victims, and that he fatally injected at least 7 others with drugs. He mentioned having killed women in Milwaukee, Madison, Chicago, and Detroit, but he refused to give specific details about any of the crimes he claimed he committed. A police spokesperson said that there is no information to substantiate McFarland's claims, but investigators were looking into the matter. For now, he remains in custody on 4 pending felonies stemming from the assault case and is serving time on an unrelated battery charge stemming from an incident in early 2023. 10. Keith Hall. 19-year-old Rachel Wilson was last seen alive on CCTV footage in the English village of Middlesbrough in 2002. For at least 2 years, she had been heavily addicted to crack cocaine. Her family had become so concerned about her weight loss that they had urged her to get help. But they did not know just how badly her life had spiraled out of control, and were unaware that a man more than twice her age was forcing her to work the streets to support not only her habit, but his drug use as well. Rachel was introduced to crack by Keith Hall, who made her work as a prostitute almost every night. She typically walked the streets near Keith's studio apartment, where he could easily keep an eye on her and take her earnings throughout her shift. On May 30th, 2002, Rachel spent the day with her family, then headed into Middlesbrough town centre on foot shortly before midnight. Despite Rachel's struggles, she maintained daily contact with her family, so they found it odd when she fell out of touch for an entire weekend. They reported her missing, and the 18-month investigation that followed failed to turn up any sign of the teen. With no leads to go on, police closed the case, but continued to review it periodically. In June 2012, almost exactly 10 years after Rachel vanished, construction workers found her skeletal remains in a drainage ditch on a farm outside town. Filled with renewed determination and hope to finally solve the case, law enforcement launched a new investigation called Operation Seaton. 2 years later, police identified Keith as a suspect in Rachel's murder. During a search of his property, they found a lock of the young woman's hair and a note she had written, which they believed Hall had kept as mementos, which killers are sometimes known to do. Keith was interviewed 9 times over the next 5 years, but consistently denied any involvement in Rachel's disappearance or demise, or knowing anything about what happened to her. In the meantime, several witnesses came forward with information about incriminating statements that Keith had made in reference to the murder. Finally, in 2019, More than 17 years after Rachel disappeared, Keith was charged with her murder, along with preventing the course of justice and living off immoral earnings. Prosecutors theorized that he beat Rachel to death for not returning with enough money after a night of working, but only 2 people will ever know exactly what happened. One of them was dead, and the other was not talking. Keith maintained his innocence and refused to even discuss the possibility of a plea deal. But he had a change of heart on the first day of his trial and pleaded guilty to manslaughter. He was sentenced to 18.5 years in prison and has never provided the specific details about Rachel's death. 9. Gerald Griffin. In September 2011, 31-year-old Queens, New York resident Peter Polizzi was found naked, clinging to life, and stuffed beneath a couch in his Ridgewood apartment. The pizzeria owner was rushed to the hospital with blunt force trauma injuries and died a few days later. 2 cell phones, an expensive watch, cash, and a box filled with a powdery white substance had been stolen from the crime scene. Inside the residence, police found a bloodied baseball bat and an empty wine glass that they believed the killer had used. A witness saw 2 men leaving Polizzi's apartment on the night of the attack, but their identities remained a mystery and the case went cold. Pieces of the puzzle began falling into place in 2015 when cold case detectives revisited the case file. They scoured the victim's phone records and came across a number of a prostitute who was with Polizzi on the day of his murder. She identified her pimp, 46-year-old Gerald Griffin, as one of Polizzi's attackers and admitted to being in the apartment with him and another man during the deadly assault. Detectives further connected Griffin to the crime through a Facebook photo of him wearing the stolen watch. In 2018, authorities arrested Griffin on suspicion of Polizzi's murder. Another 5 years later, in 2023, a jury convicted him of second-degree murder, burglary, 2 robbery counts, intimidating a witness, attempted tampering with evidence, criminal possession of stolen property, and a weapon-related charge. He's currently serving a 25-year sentence at Sing Sing and will become eligible for parole in 2043. 8. Samuel Whiteside. A Boston-based pimp named Samuel Whiteside was furious when a woman he bought from a New York City pimp abruptly left without doing any work and went back to her original pimp. In June of 2012, Whiteside called Victor Martino while driving from Boston to New York and demanded a payment of $1,500 to $2,000 that he felt was owed to him for his losses. The men argued over the phone without reaching a resolution to their disagreement, and Whiteside continued driving. He went to a hotel in the Bronx where Martino was staying, forced his way into his rival pimp's room, and stabbed him 3 times during a fight. The victim's marijuana dealer, Amir Hollenshed, ran into the bathroom and hid. Whiteside fled the scene, as Martino bled out from a deep knife wound to the neck. When Hollenshed exited the bathroom and found Martino clinging to life, he shouted for help and caught the attention of a hotel employee who called 911. By the time help arrived, Martino was dead. After the stabbing, Whiteside drove to a motel in East Brunswick, New Jersey, where he picked up one of his prostitutes. When the woman named MS in the court documents noticed blood on Whiteside's shoe, he told her that he had gotten into a fight with Martino. He allegedly said he was not sure if Martino was just hurt or if something worse had happened, and that Martino had displayed what looked like a gun in a bag during their confrontation. MS would later testify that Whiteside seemed scared but not shocked when they found out Martino had died. In 2013, federal authorities charged Whiteside with Martino's murder. In addition to the details of Martino's murder, the court learned of Whiteside's reputation for brutally abusing the woman who worked for him. One former prostitute testified that Whiteside had hit and choked her on several occasions, and that she had witnessed similar violence against other women. She said that Whiteside banned his prostitutes from speaking with men other than potential clients, and recalled an incident when he struck her for talking to another pimp. Whiteside testified in his own defense, claiming that he knew he was outnumbered because he could hear several people talking inside Martino's hotel room. He feared he would get jumped, but he wanted his money, and he was willing to fight to get it if necessary. During the struggle with Martino, Whiteside claimed he got a hold of his opponent's gun and taunted him with it, but did not use it. He claimed that Martino was alive when he left the hotel, and that he did not think Martino would die based on his condition at that time. In 2015, Whiteside pleaded guilty to crossing state lines for the purpose of committing murder. He appealed his conviction the following year and was found guilty of a reduced manslaughter charge. Records show he was released from prison in 2022. 7. Terrence Cook. Just 9 days after moving into a new flat in the Welsh town of Pasquensley in 2011, 48-year-old Richard Carslake was found bound and murdered on his air mattress inside his home. He had been asphyxiated and robbed of his laptop, some cash, some DVDs, and his bank cards, which the suspects tried unsuccessfully to withdraw cash with at least 7 times. Police connected the crime to a 40-year-old local pimp, Terrence Cook, and a 19-year-old prostitute who worked for him named Tyler Phillips. Tyler turned himself in after finding out he was wanted and that Terrence went on the run. He was captured in Belgium on an international arrest warrant and extradited back to Wales, where he and Tyler pleaded not guilty to Richard's murder. According to prosecutors, Terrence and Tyler propositioned the victim at a gay bar. Having recently lost his job and gone through a breakup, Richard was lonely. He invited the men back to his flat, where he allowed them to tie him up. But the situation stopped being consensual when he was viciously attacked and completely unable to defend himself. It was impossible to say which of the 2 men killed the victim, and they took advantage of this in court by pointing the finger at one another as the accused murderer. The judge believed that Terrence was more likely the killer due to his criminal history, which had earned him the classification of a dangerous offender. But there was no way of knowing for sure, and both defendants eventually pled guilty to manslaughter and robbery. Terrence received an indeterminate sentence with a minimum of 5 years in custody, under the stipulation that he would be released if and when he no longer posed a threat to the public. Tyler was sentenced to 7 years in a young offenders institution. Richard's sister, Jeanette Jones, said she was glad her brother's killers were off the streets, but she criticized both sentences for being too lenient. She told the South Wales Argus that she thinks the British legal system needs to be changed to better ensure that victims and their loved ones have an opportunity to get proper justice. 6. Raymond Sharp. In July of 2011, 911 dispatchers in Las Vegas received a call from a local resident who said that a nearly naked woman with a bleeding head injury had banged on their door for help. The caller reported seeing their neighbor, Raymond Sharp, grabbing the woman by the hair and dragging her back to his apartment. Later identified as Alicia Grundy, she rushed out of Sharp's apartment when the police arrived. She identified Sharp as her pimp and claimed that he had pistol whipped her when she told him that she wanted to quit prostituting and that she had a new boyfriend. After catching up to Grundy in her attempt to escape and dragging her back into the apartment, Sharp allegedly threatened to shoot her if the police came. He was gone from the apartment by the time law enforcement arrived and was seen running down the street a short while later with a water bottle in his hand. Sharp claimed to have no idea about what just happened to Grundy, but the police did not believe his story. He was charged with 13 crimes, including 9 counts pertaining to the attack on Grundy and 4 counts for some stripped vehicles that were found outside his residence. Later that year, a jury found Sharp guilty on all counts, including kidnapping with use of a deadly weapon, domestic violence battery resulting in substantial bodily harm, burglary, living with a prostitute, living off prostitution earnings, pandering with force, assault with a deadly weapon, possession of a stolen vehicle, destroying or disassembling motor vehicles, and more. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. 2 years later, in 2013, Sharp was convicted of 5 additional gun-related counts. He adamantly maintained his innocence, even after being sent to prison, where he spent a lot of time in the law library educating himself on the ways he could fight his convictions. In his attempts to get his case back into the courtroom, he filed an appeal accusing his former attorney of ineffective counsel and claimed that faulty evidence had been used against him. In early 2024, Sharp negotiated a deal with prosecutors, which resulted in all 18 of his previous convictions being dropped. He pleaded guilty to kidnapping, coercion with force, and possession of a firearm by an ex-felon, and received credit for the 13 years he had already served, resulting in his release at the end of February. Speaking with 9 News Now, Sharp admitted that he was not entirely happy with the outcome of the case, even though it helped him regain his freedom. He wanted more of the problems with his case to be exposed and felt he had been released on the system's terms rather than his own. He He especially wished that flirtatious text messages between Grundy and one of the detectives on the case had been exposed. Grundy had shared the messages with Sharp after recanting her original story and apologizing to him. Grundy told 8 News Now that she was suffering from Stockholm Syndrome and had felt the need to protect her abuser. The news outlet reached out to the detective that Grundy exchanged messages with and confirmed that he no longer works for the police department, but Sharp believes that more needs to be done to address corruption within the agency's ranks. 5. Samori Moses. Early one morning in January 2017, a woman's limbless torso was found at a landfill in the Bronx. Police traced the body parts to a garbage truck driver, who told investigators that he had collected the remains from an acquaintance named Samori Moses. During a search of Samori's Brooklyn apartment, police found the victim's head, hands, and feet inside a chest freezer. Identified as the suspect's girlfriend, 32-year-old Leandra Foster, she had been beaten to death. Samori claimed that he awoke to the sounds of Leandra being assaulted by a client who had come to the apartment for her escorting services. According to the suspect's version of events, he threw the attacker out and struck Leandra several times for not alerting him to her need for help sooner. He told investigators that Leandra died while falling in the shower. In 2019, Samori was convicted on state charges of negligent homicide and concealment of a corpse. To the shock and horror of Leandra's loved ones and others who followed the case, he was acquitted of murder. The verdict came after prosecutors argued that Leandra's injuries were too severe for her death to be unintentional, while the defense claimed that the disgraced pimp would never kill Leandra on purpose because she was worth more to him alive. Samori was sentenced to just 4 years in prison. He was scheduled to be paroled in 2022 when federal prosecutors stepped in and charged him with trafficking resulting in death. Samori also faced 9 trafficking counts for allegedly forcing Leandra and 8 other women to work as prostitutes over a nearly 20-year period. According to prosecutors, he lured women into romantic relationships, then pimped them out under threats of violence. He routinely beat his victims, including one woman who nearly died. He kept nearly all their earnings and forced some of the women, including Leandra, to get his name tattooed on their bodies. All 8 surviving victims testified in the case. One woman recalled an incident when Samori bit a chunk of her flesh and spat it at her, while another woman described being cut with a razor and having lemon juice poured in her wounds, causing extensive scarring all over her body. When one victim said she did not want to work for Samori, he allegedly held a gun to her head and threatened to kill her. In September 2023, the 47-year-old pleaded guilty to all 10 charges. He pleaded for leniency in a letter to the judge, claiming he was a changed man who finally wanted to do something productive and positive with his life. Not surprisingly, the judge was unconvinced by Samori's pleas, and he was sentenced to 10 concurrent life terms. 4. William Sanga. On Good Friday in 1999, firefighters responded to an abandoned butcher shop in London's North Wembley district in the middle of the night, where they found the corpse of an adult male tied to an armchair and engulfed in flames. The victim had been brutally beaten, but the medical examiner was unable to determine whether he was still alive when he was set on fire. Identified as 28-year-old William Sanga, the victim had moved to London from Uganda as an asylum seeker in the early 90s. His only arrest in the UK was for a driving offence, and he appeared to keep to himself. Yet his death seemed like the type of killing that someone would fall victim to as a result of a criminal or high-risk lifestyle. As they dug into William's background, investigators discovered that he ran a lucrative escorting agency that raked in £250,000 per year, roughly the equivalent to £462,000 in modern funds. He established the agency 3 years before his death and mostly employed women from the former Soviet Union and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. William ran his business by phone and had not even met any of the women who worked for him. After his murder, a police spokesperson said that the lack of information detectives had about William complicated their ability to solve the case. He had acquaintances, but no actual friends, despite having been in England for 8 years. William also appeared to have no family in the country, and investigators ruled out the likelihood of his murder being politically motivated, despite his father being a politician who was assassinated in Uganda. Police eventually linked William's murder to a pimp, Vincent Reed, and a Bosnian prostitute named Suada Gridel. According to prosecutors, Vincent used Suada to lure the victim to a hotel room, where he punched and kicked him in the head with such force that one of his teeth fell out and blood splattered on the nearby furniture. William choked to death on his own vomit after falling unconscious, but Vincent and Suada insisted in court that they did not mean to kill him. They claimed that their intention was just to scare the victim over some money he allegedly owed Vincent. The defendants pleaded not guilty to murder and admitted to manslaughter, and the judge accepted their claim that William's death was unintentional. Vincent received a 5-year prison sentence, and Suada was sentenced to 3 years of probation. 3. Robert Spencer. While working as a downtown Spokane, Washington in November 2004, Jonah Pacello was approached by a car. The vehicle was driven by 42-year-old Robert Tracy Spencer, whose girlfriend, 21-year-old Abigail Meckel, was in the passenger seat. He persuaded Jonah to get into the vehicle, and they went to a local hotel where they used crack cocaine. After hanging out for a few hours, Spencer tried persuading Jonah to work for him as a prostitute. When she refused, he allegedly punched her in the mouth and slapped her repeatedly, marking the beginning of a grueling 24-hour campaign of abuse. Jonah would later tell police that Spencer held her captive and refused to let her use the phone, and he became violent when she tried leaving. Desperate to escape his clutches, Jonah eventually agreed to work for him. Spencer sent her out onto the streets to look for clients, and she sought refuge at the apartment of a friend, 40-year-old James Allen Johnston. A few days later, Spencer, Meckel, and Spencer's nephew Brian James went to Johnston's apartment building and entered the unit without permission. As Spencer tried forcing Jonah to leave with them, Jonah called out to Johnston for help. He stepped between Spencer and Jonah, and the two men began fighting. At one point, Spencer and his accomplices left. They came back a short while later, and Spencer struck Johnston in the forehead with a metal pipe. As Johnston responded by taking a swing, either Spencer or Brian shot him in the abdomen. He died from his injuries, including the gunshot wound and a head wound from blunt force trauma. Both Spencer and Brian were charged with first-degree murder while committing first-degree burglary, second-degree murder, assault, and burglary. Spencer's girlfriend Abigail was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and promoting prostitution. During a jail interview with Spokesman Review, she accused the authorities of putting words in her mouth and denied that Jonah was held against her will, implying that the victim was high and hallucinating. Meckel begrudgingly took a plea deal and admitted to first-degree burglary and second-degree assault. She maintained her innocence during her plea hearing, claiming that she was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when Jonah was assaulted and Johnston was killed. The judge sentenced her to a minimum prison term of 21.5 years. Spencer took his case to trial and was found guilty of second-degree murder, kidnapping, promoting prostitution, and 2 counts of assault. He was sentenced to nearly 45 years in prison. 2. Christopher Sawyers. When 47-year-old Kenneth Chapman stopped communicating with his sister in January 2014, she grew concerned and requested a welfare check at his home in the English town of Eccles. Police arrived at the flat in the Greater Manchester area to find Chapman dead, with no immediately visible clues as to what might have killed him. Based on the body's decomposition, it was obvious that he had been dead for several days. An autopsy found that Chapman had died from a massive morphine overdose, which one pathologist later described as the biggest overdose he had ever seen. Investigators traced the crime to a 23-year-old prostitute named Christy Edmondson and her pimp, 36-year-old Christopher Sawyers. According to authorities, Chapman financially supported Edmondson. He was high on heroin and semi-conscious when Edmondson called Sawyers over to ransack the home. Chapman had recently discovered newspaper articles detailing Sawyers' past criminal convictions, which may have been an additional reason why Sawyers injected him with a fatal dose of heroin after arriving at the flat. The career criminal boasted about how he was now a serial killer. About a year and a half earlier, Sawyers had allegedly injected 60-year-old Peter Clark in Withington with a fatal dose of heroin. By the time emergency responders arrived at Clark's home, Sawyers had run off with his phone and debit card. It was too late to save Clark's life, but he might have survived if Sawyers had cared more about getting him help than he did about stealing his friend's property. Following Chapman's murder nearly 18 months later, Sawyers and Edmondson posed for photos with the victim's dead body in the background. The pair returned to Chapman's flat several times over a 5-day period, treating it like a cash pad while somehow ignoring the presence of the homeowner's decaying body. During that time, they repeatedly stole from the property and attempted to defraud Chapman several times. The disturbing trophy photos, along with other examples of the couple's cold and callous behavior, were used against them in court when they went for trial for their crimes. Prosecutors also secured testimony from witnesses who said that Sawyers had casually joked about killing Chapman at a New Year's Eve gathering. In 2014, Sawyers was found guilty of Chapman's murder and the manslaughter of Clark. He was sentenced to 33 years in prison. Edmondson cooperated with prosecutors and admitted to a series of theft and fraud charges in exchange for the murder charge being dropped. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison. 1. Malcolm Querido. In September 2014, 38-year-old Robert Bullard of Medway, Massachusetts, went to an apartment in Providence, Rhode Island, to meet a woman from an online escorting ad. During the visit, they got into an argument about the payment amount. The woman's pimp, 27-year-old Malcolm Querido, burst into the room and stabbed Robert to death, then fled the scene. Malcolm had a lengthy criminal history, which included past prison sentences for robbery and felony assault. By the time authorities issued a warrant for his arrest, he had gone on the run. He kept a low profile for more than 7 months before becoming a suspect in the murder of 39-year-old Kareem Barnes, who was gunned down in an apartment building hallway. Malcolm was located in New York City later that year after being arrested on a gun charge. He was finally extradited to Rhode Island 2 years later in 2017 after being acquitted in the gun case. Police already had DNA evidence connecting him to Robert's murder, but they wanted to collect a DNA sample from Malcolm to confirm the accuracy of their findings, so they obtained a warrant and gave him several chances to cooperate. When Malcolm refused to provide the sample, jail guards and police officers pepper sprayed him, tied him to a chair, and forcefully swabbed his mouth. The defense filed a motion to have the new sample excluded as evidence, arguing that the forceful DNA collection violated his Fourth Amendment right against unlawful search and seizure. A judge agreed in a 2018 ruling, describing footage of the incident as one of the most disturbing clips he had seen in a long time. 2 years later, the state Supreme Court reversed the decision, ruling that the use of force was objectively reasonable. Malcolm's case finally went to trial in early 2024, nearly 10 years after Robert's death. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and is currently awaiting his sentence.
8. Lydia Leon Batuecha Maria. During July 2018, a 26-year-old exotic dancer from Florida named Lydia Leon Batuecha Maria was accused of stealing $1,300 out of a customer's wallet during a private one-on-one dance at a club located in Largo. According to an arrest report made from the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office, Maria made an attempt to leave the club after snatching the man's cash, but was quickly stopped by security. She then allegedly admitted to stealing the money and was taken to jail for suspicion of grand theft. The outcome of the case is currently unclear, but records show that she is not currently being held in state custody, which hopefully means that she squared away her legal case and has moved on with her life. 7. Video shoot gets violent. As the world came spinning to a halt as it coped with the first phase of the COVID-19 pandemic in April 2020, the American rapper Blueface apparently wasn't ready to set his career on hold for the lockdown life. Instead, he invited multiple people over to his home in Los Angeles and planned to shoot a music video. A fight broke out among a group of thong-wearing dancers when two women started ganging up on another. Blueface, whose real name is actually Jonathan Jamal Porter, seemed uninterested in breaking up the disagreement as he stood on the sidelines, watching and filming the altercation with his phone. He was also heard laughing in the background of the video while a few of the producers who were there at the time tried intervening. But the warring women continuously escaped their grasp, continued throwing punches, and went on wrestling one another to the floor. Shortly after the footage went viral online, Blueface explained in a follow-up post that the women weren't really fighting over him. He said that the exchange was sparked by a mix of a lot of Henny and some pretty bad attitudes. The rapper did not reveal how the fight was finally stopped, whether the police had to get involved, or if any arrests were made. 6. Flat tire fatality. 55-year-old Ralph Cross was discovered dead in his Wilson City, Missouri home back in August 2017, after helping a few stranded motorists with a flat tire. Someone shot him in the back, ransacked his home, making it extremely clear that the victim was murdered in a robbery. Witnesses reported seeing Cross talking on the side of the road with 4 women, whose vehicle had Tennessee license plates. They were later identified as exotic dancers Brittany Curry, Panisha Taylor, Jonisha Simmons, and Latisha Dotson. The women worked at clubs located in Memphis and Nashville. Investigators found records showing that Cross was at a local tire shop at the time he was helping the women. People who knew the victim closely described him as a kind and caring man who was quick to lend a hand to those in need. Because of this, it didn't surprise anyone that he took time out of his day to rescue 4 strangers that were stranded on a roadside. Cross was last seen alive outside his home early the next morning by a neighbor, who said that they overheard an argument between Cross and 3 of the women, while a 4th suspect sat in a car waiting outside. The neighbor also told detectives that he heard a loud noise and tried to see what was happening. He reportedly noticed 3 of the suspects rushing out of the house and jumping into the car not long after the commotion. As they fled the scene, the women allegedly stopped and warned the neighbor not to go into Cross's house. After being identified as the primary suspects in the case, they decided to turn themselves in to law enforcement and were subsequently charged with murder. The accused shooter, Brittany Curry, pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to serve 16 years in prison. Records show that Panisha Taylor also served a 2-year sentence at a Tennessee prison and was released back in 2021. But it's unclear whether the punishment was related to her alleged role in Cross's death or not. Based on the lack of prison records for the other 2 suspects, it's unlikely they were convicted of playing a major role in the crime. 5. Yuen Rivera Bosa. What was supposed to be a fun visit to a Miami strip club ended up costing one unfortunate Florida man $62,000 in May 2023, when he got so drunk in a VIP room that he couldn't even stand up on his own. He woke up the next day and was shocked to find that several of his banking and credit accounts had been completely drained. According to police officers, the victim received private lap dances from at least 5 separate dancers, including 34-year-old Yuen Rivera Bosa. As the women poured shots of tequila down the man's throat, Rivera Bosa allegedly ran off with his wallet and cell phone. The victim finally sobered up enough to get himself home at about 4 o'clock in the morning. But by then, he hadn't noticed that his money was missing. It took a few hours before he realized. He discovered several large unauthorized payments to the club from his accounts, along with transactions that moved money into Rivera Bosa's bank account. Rivera Bosa reportedly admitted to making the transfers herself, but said that the victim gave her permission to send the money. During a search of the suspect's cell phone, investigators saw a text message from Rivera Bosa to her friend and husband complaining that the victim discovered the theft and canceled one of the money transfers. Law enforcement also found evidence that the suspect may have been selling illegal growth hormones and steroids to several of the club's customers. Rivera Bosa was later charged with committing an organized scheme to defraud, fraudulent use of a credit card for $100 or more, grand theft, and selling narcotics without a prescription. Unfortunately, the current status of the case is unclear. 4. Jennifer Lynn Morrissey. After becoming a single mom, Jennifer Lynn Morrissey started dancing at a strip club in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, just to make ends meet. In 2013, she began dating a 60-year-old businessman named Michael McNew, who was one of her regular customers. McNew acted as Morrissey's sugar daddy for years, paying her bills and supporting her financially through her drug addiction and run-ins with the law. He also took Morrissey on vacations and bought her expensive presents like cars and motorcycles. The relationship between McNew and Morrissey was on and off. At one point, Morrissey even lived with McNew for a short period of time. But McNew threatened to end things for good in August 2017, after Morrissey got with a new boyfriend who happened to be a member of a motorcycle gang. Around the same time, McNew went radio silent and stopped going to work. He was discovered dead in his home with a gunshot wound to the head just a few days later, after his boss got worried due to his absences and reached out to his family. Text messages from the day of the murder revealed that McNew kicked Morrissey out of his house and said he was going to put her belongings into a storage locker. He also said that he was ready to defend himself and warned Morrissey against coming back to his house. Morrissey responded to this with a threat to cut McNew's throat and gut him like a deer. She even said to get ready because she was on her way. She later claimed in court that she accidentally shot McNew during a fight over his gun, and that he charged at her like a madman with a weapon in hand. The court didn't buy Morrissey's self-defense claim for a second, especially since a friend she called to help her dispose of evidence testified that nothing at the scene looked like an accident. Detectives finally concluded that McNew was shot in cold blood at point-blank range, with the barrel of the gun positioned less than an inch from the front of his face. Morrissey tried to stage the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong, but the evidence spoke for itself. Jailhouse informants also helped to solidify the case against her. Morrissey was eventually found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. 3. Luracy Ashley Ross. During the morning one day in December 2011, a father of 7 named Boudreaux Briscoe was robbed and shot by 2 men outside an apartment building in Houston. He was there to pick up his friend, a 20-year-old exotic dancer named Luracy Ashley Ross, when the ambush occurred. Briscoe's cousin told investigators that Ross, whose stage name was Pocahontas, told Briscoe to meet her in the building's courtyard. The cousin was there waiting in Briscoe's truck when he saw the attack. The victim was immediately rushed to the hospital, where he passed away from his injuries a few days later. By the time investigators identified Ross as a possible suspect, she had already gone on the run. According to prosecutors, Ross lured several men she met at her job to her apartment building, where her boyfriend, 24-year-old Kevin Johnson, robbed them. A previous victim, Carlton Donato, told police that Ross and Johnson came to his home and robbed him at gunpoint. Johnson allegedly shot Donato before he and Ross left the scene. Donato survived his injuries from that incident and was able to identify Ross in a photo lineup. She was facing an aggravated robbery charge in connection to Donato's shooting when Briscoe was killed. 3 months later, Ross was captured and charged with capital murder. Records show that she's now serving a 50-year prison sentence for 2 counts of aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon. She'll become eligible for parole in 2037. There are many inmates named Kevin Johnson serving time in Texas, but it's unclear if any of them are there for Briscoe's murder. 2. Olivia Bennett. In early 2015, a 22-year-old Ontario man named Alexander Sangwan almost lost his life during a trip to Miami when a BMW plowed into him one morning as he tried to hail a taxi. He was heading back to his hotel after visiting a strip club the night before with his brother, Andrew, who witnessed the crash. The driver hit Sang-hwan from behind and sped off without stopping. Sang-hwan sustained a serious head injury, along with shattered bones in his shoulder and leg. He was taken to the hospital in critical condition and put into a medically induced coma. In the meantime, investigators identified the primary suspect as a 26-year-old exotic dancer named Olivia Bennett, who worked at the club Sang-hwan was leaving when he got hit. She allegedly abandoned her car not long after the crash and went on the run, but turned herself in after realizing a manhunt was underway. Authorities quickly charged her with leaving the scene of an accident. Sang-hwan regained consciousness almost a month after the crash. While his family was relieved that he'd pulled through and survived, they were devastated after realizing the extent of his injuries. Shortly before the trip to Miami, Sang-hwan had been accepted to medical school, but these plans were put on hold as he started an extremely long road to recovery. The young man's mom told the Ottawa Citizen that Alex recognized family members and tried to speak to them, but could only manage to mouth words. Doctors predicted that it would take several months or even longer for him to regain his mobility fully and become functional again. His current condition and the outcome of Bennett's criminal case are unknown, but hopefully he recovered and was able to pursue his life goals. 1. Felicia Blakeley. In August 2022, two families' lives were unexpectedly turned upside down when 34-year-old Raymond Goodwin and 35-year-old Claudel Doc Christmas were robbed and killed at Goodwin's apartment in Atlanta, Georgia. Goodwin's sister, Carletta Jones, was speaking on the phone with one of the victims at the time and could hear women in the background saying, get the money," after shots were fired. By the time Jones arrived at Goodwin's home to see what was happening, he and Christmas were already dead. That summer, Atlanta's club scene was booming. Robberies were on the rise, and men like Goodwin and Christmas, who carried large amounts of money during their outings, were often the primary targets. There were no signs of forced entry into Goodwin's house, leading detectives to believe the victims knew their killers and welcomed them inside. Jones told detectives that her brother and Christmas had been hanging out with some exotic dancers, nicknamed Peaches and Snow, but she didn't know the women's actual names. 2 days later, 29-year-old Lemetrius Michi Twitty was also found robbed and killed in a similar fashion. A gold Nissan Maxima he'd recently rented was missing from his driveway. Like Goodwin and Christmas, Twitty was known for visiting the city's clubs often. Shell casings at the scene matched the bullets that had been used to kill the previous two victims, leading investigators to believe that all three victims were targeted by the same suspects. A break in the case finally came about 10 days later, when a fast food worker called 911 to report a few suspicious customers. The incident came during a string of burglaries at the fast food chain, and the company's employees had been warned to keep an eye out for strange behavior. Officers arrived and found 18-year-old Felicia Blakeley, or Peaches, hiding in the bathroom with 20-year-old Armesia Irvin, or Snow. 2 guns were also discovered hidden in the bathroom's toilet tank, and a Nissan parked outside the restaurant was identified as Twitty's missing rental car. During questioning, Blakeley admitted to killing Goodwin, Christmas, and Twitty. She also confessed to several of the fast food burglaries. Irvin admitted to her role in the crimes as well. Blakeley claimed that she and Irvin went to the murder victims' homes with plans to rob them, but she tried to shift the blame onto her pimp, Michael Berry, claiming that he'd forced her and Irvin to commit the robberies. Berry was never charged in connection to the killings. In 2004, Blakeley pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder to avoid the death penalty, and was sentenced to life without parole. Irvin also took a plea deal and admitted to a lesser charge in exchange for a shorter sentence of 14 years.
Thanks for watching. Would you rather live next door to someone who does not bother you directly, but has a constant revolving door of shady guests cycling in and out of their home? Or a seemingly harmless but unbearably annoying loner who comes over and talks to you every time you step outside? Let us know in the comments below and remember to subscribe.